My father-in-law stood at my gate and screamed to the whole neighborhood, "This woman stole from my son and must leave today." The whole street watched the police put handcuffs on him. Instead, the neighbor across the street covered her mouth when she saw me step out of the car. She had watched them drag my bags to the curb 2 years ago. She had heard the screaming. Now she was watching the police put handcuffs on the man who did the screaming. Nobody on that block said a single word. There is a kind of woman this world does not know how to hold. She gives everything she has, her time, her softness, her faith. And the people closest to her mistake that generosity for weakness. They take from her quietly, then loudly, then publicly. And they never once stop to consider that the same woman who stayed silent through all of it might be the most dangerous kind of dangerous there is. Her name was Diane, and this is her story. 3 years before that morning, before the handcuffs, before the black sedan, before the whole block went quiet, Diane was a different woman. Not a broken one, not a weak one. Just one who did not yet know the full shape of what she was carrying. If you've ever loved someone all the way down to the bottom of yourself and still come up empty, stay with me. Because what happened in between those 2 years is the part nobody in her neighborhood ever knew. And by the time this story is done, you're going to understand exactly why some people's silence should have been the thing that scared everyone the most. Atlanta sits differently in the morning. The light comes in low and gold, and the neighborhoods that don't make the magazines still have their own particular grace. Kids on bikes, somebody's grandmother on the porch, the smell of breakfast coming through a screen door. Diane loved her block for exactly that reason. It felt like something real. She was 38 years old, a healthcare administrator at a mid-sized clinic on the Northwest Side. The kind of woman who remembered everybody's birthday and still had time to bring food to the church potluck. She had a way of making rooms feel warmer just by walking into them. That wasn't performance. That was just Diane. She had been married to Cordell for 6 years. Cordell was handsome in the way that makes women overlook things. Tall, easy smile, the kind of man who knew how to be charming in public and just slightly absent at home. Not cruel, not obviously broken, just not quite all the way present, the way a house can look solid from the street, while something in the foundation has already begun to shift. They had bought their home together, saved together. Diane had contributed more than half the down payment from years of careful discipline, money she had been setting aside since before she even met Cordell. Money that lived in a separate savings account she maintained like a personal promise to herself. When they signed the papers on that house, she felt like the life she had been building in her mind had finally become physical. Something she could touch. On their 3rd wedding anniversary, Cordell gave her a letter, handwritten on cream paper, folded into thirds, tucked inside a card that said simply, "For you, always." She read it twice that night and then pressed it flat inside the back of her Bible, the way her mother had taught her to keep the things that mattered. The letter said, "I will always be your safe place. Whatever comes, whatever changes, this house and this life belong to both of us. I promise you that." She believed him. She believed it completely. That was not foolishness. That was just what love looks like before it gets educated. The first time Gerald Washington said something that cut, Diane almost missed it. It was a Sunday dinner, the 3rd month after they'd moved into the house. Gerald was Cordell's father, a deacon at Calvary Baptist, a man with a voice built for pews and proclamation. He sat at the head of their table like he had always sat there, like the house had been his before they arrived. Beverly, Cordell's mother, sat beside him and said almost nothing, which Diane had initially taken for shyness. She would understand later that Beverly's silence was a kind of participation. "Diane," Gerald said, setting down his fork with the careful precision of a man making a point. "These gravy's thin. You want me to ask Beverly to show you her recipe?" Cordell laughed. Not a big laugh, a polite one. The kind that says, "I hear you. I don't want to deal with this right now." Diane smiled and said the gravy was a new recipe she was trying. Gerald made a small sound in his throat that meant he wasn't convinced, and the dinner continued. Diane cleared the table and washed the dishes and told herself it was nothing. Older men had a way of talking. She knew that. She wasn't going to be the kind of daughter-in-law who couldn't take a comment about gravy. But it wasn't just the gravy. It was the comment 3 weeks later at Beverly's birthday dinner, when Gerald patted Cordell on the shoulder in front of the entire family and said, "Boy, when you going to give us some grandchildren? Don't let your first wife run out the clock on you." He laughed when he said it. Cordell's cousin laughed. Diane sat very still and kept her expression smooth because she had grown up in a family that taught her that dignity was sometimes the only armor you had. She went home that night and called her best friend, Keisha. Keisha had been her friend since college. They had stood in each other's weddings, cried in each other's cars, kept each other's secrets in the locked part of themselves that doesn't open for just anyone. Diane told her what Gerald said. Keisha listened, made the right sounds, said all the right things. "Girl, he is something else. Don't even let that man take up space in your head." Diane felt better after that call. She always did. That was the thing about Keisha. She knew exactly how to make you feel held. What Diane didn't know, and would not know for 2 more years, was that Keisha called Beverly the next morning, had been calling Beverly for almost a year, was feeding information in both directions, not out of malice, she would later claim, but out of a complicated loyalty she had never bothered to examine. Keisha loved Diane. She also liked being the one who knew things. Sometimes those two things cannot exist in the same person without one of them eventually destroying the other. Meanwhile, Cordell began coming home late. Not dramatically late, not the kind that announces itself. Just 40 minutes here, an hour there. Business dinners he didn't mention until the morning of. Phone calls he took in the car instead of inside. And whenever Diane asked him about his day with the careful casualness of a woman who is trying not to seem like she's asking, Gerald would somehow call the next morning with a ready explanation. It took Diane a few months to notice the pattern, that Gerald always seemed to know what Cordell had been doing before Diane did, that the information flowed upward before it moved sideways, that her husband had a primary loyalty that preceded their marriage and lived somewhere she wasn't allowed to look. There was one Sunday toward the end of that second year when the church held their annual women's ministry brunch. 20 women in nice dresses in the fellowship hall, laughing and sharing testimony. Diane was there. Keisha was there. 3 of the other women from the inner circle were there. After the brunch, Diane went to the restroom, and when she came back, the conversation at the table had clearly just shifted. There was the particular stillness of a group that has been talking about someone who has just walked back in. Diane sat down and smiled and pretended she hadn't noticed. But she had noticed. She always noticed. She had just not yet learned what to do with the things she noticed. There was a particular dynamic that Diane would only name clearly in hindsight, the way you can only see the shape of a wave once you're already in it. Cordell was not a mean man. That was the confusing part. He was not cruel the way Gerald was. Direct, deliberate, loud about it. Cordell's particular mode of failing her was softer. He failed her by always choosing the path of least resistance, which in their marriage meant choosing his father every single time the two things were in conflict. He did it gently, with an apologetic look, with a joke that was supposed to diffuse the tension. He had spent 40 years learning how to make a woman feel like the problem was her inability to lighten up, and he deployed that skill on Diane so naturally she didn't recognize it as a skill for the first 3 years. Keisha came for dinner one evening in late September, the year before everything came apart. They sat on Diane's back porch with wine and the kind of easy company that comes from years of shared history. And Diane said, carefully, not urgently, just honestly, that she was worried about Cordell. That something felt different. That he seemed to have one foot somewhere else and she couldn't figure out where. Keisha refilled Diane's glass and said, "Girl, all men go through phases. You know how they are. He's probably just stressed about something at work. Don't make it bigger than it is." Diane nodded. She trusted that. She trusted Keisha's read because Keisha had always been the one in their friendship with the cleaner eye for other people's situations, the one who could see through things. Diane told herself she was the one who was too close to it. What she did not know was that Keisha had been to Beverly's house for dinner 3 weeks before that evening on the porch, had sat at Beverly's kitchen table and eaten Beverly's food and described in detail the things Diane had confided to her over the past months, the concerns about Cordell's distance, the question about the finances, the way Diane sometimes cried in her car on the way home from church. Keisha had told herself she was being a bridge, that she was helping, that the best outcome for everyone was a marriage that stayed together, and sometimes that required a little careful management of information. That was the story Keisha told herself. Diane would spend a long time deciding whether Keisha believed it. In the end, she decided it didn't matter. What matters is not what people telling themselves about the harm they do. What matters is the harm. She went home that afternoon and sat in her bedroom for a long time. She opened her Bible to the back, touched the edge of the folded letter, and didn't take it out. She just let her fingers rest on it. She was not afraid yet. She was something quieter than afraid. She was a woman beginning to understand that the world she thought she was living in might not be the one she was actually in. She did not yet know how right she was. She came home early on a Wednesday in March because her conference in Buckhead ended a day ahead of schedule. Canceled flight, rerouted, caught a car from the airport and was back by 4 in the afternoon when no one expected her. She heard voices before she reached the kitchen. Gerald's voice, Cordell's voice, and a third voice she didn't recognize, a man speaking in the careful cadences of someone accustomed to laying out plans. She stopped in the hallway. Later, she would ask herself why she didn't walk in. She would tell herself it was instinct, that something in her body understood the situation before her mind had caught up. The quitclaim deed just needs both signatures and a notary, the third voice was saying. We file it before the 60-day window and the transfer is clean. She won't know until it's finalized, Cordell said. She doesn't need to know until it's done. That was Gerald. Steady, practiced, like this conversation had already happened in his head 100 times. By the time she figures out what the paperwork means, it'll already be settled. Diane stood in that hallway and did not breathe. The third man, She would later learn he was a real estate attorney Gerald had known for years, shuffled papers, and said something about the mortgage language and clean title. And she caught every third word because her blood had gone cold, and the sounds were coming to her through a kind of pressure she had never felt before. She did not walk into that kitchen. She walked upstairs, closed the bedroom door, sat on the edge of the bed. She did not cry yet. She was too precise for that, right then. She was cataloging, running back through every dinner, every phone call taken in the car, every time Cordell came home and looked at her with something she had named as fatigue, but now understood was guilt. She was reframing 2 years of her life in about 4 minutes, and what emerged on the other side of that reframing was a picture so clear it made her physically cold. She opened her Bible, took out the letter, read it once, slowly. I will always be your safe place. Whatever comes, whatever changes, this house and this life belong to both of us. She folded it back, put it in her wallet, not the Bible, the wallet, and zipped it shut. She did not say anything to Cordell that night. She made dinner. She sat across from him. She let him talk about his day. She watched his mouth move and understood for the first time that she was sitting at a table with a stranger who wore her husband's face. 4 days later, a bank statement arrived. She had still been on the joint account. The balance was $43,000 less than it should have been. The transfers had begun 8 months ago. Small ones at first, then larger. A secondary account had been opened in Cordell's name only. Gerald Washington was listed as account co-holder. 8 months. They had been doing this for 8 months while she made Sunday dinner and attended women's ministry and told Keisha she was trying not to read too much into things. She called Keisha. She needed to say the words out loud to someone before they broke her open. She needed a witness. She got as far as describing the bank statement, the name of the secondary account, the approximate balance, before she noticed that Keisha's questions were too specific, too precise. The kind of questions you ask when you're confirming something you already know, not the kind you ask when you're hearing it for the first time. How long has the secondary account been open? Keisha asked. And Diane realized, in the silence after that question, that Keisha already knew the answer. Keisha had known before this phone call, possibly before last month, possibly before the month before that. Diane said, "I'll call you back," and hung up. She sat in her car in the clinic parking lot and let it arrive, not in pieces, all of it at once. The hallway, the voices, the attorney with the papers, the account balance, and now Keisha's voice asking a question she already knew the answer to. It arrived the way a verdict arrives, final, without appeal. She thought about the porch that September evening, the wine. Keisha saying, "Don't make it bigger than it is." She thought about every conversation she had brought to Keisha in confidence over the past 2 years, and understood, one by one, where those conversations had gone. She sat there and she did the work of reframing, the brutal, necessary work of taking everything you believed was one thing and holding it up to the light of what it actually was. That work takes time. Most people don't give themselves permission to do it all the way through. They stop at the first layer of grief because the second layer is worse, and the third layer is worse than that. Diane did not stop. She sat in that parking lot until she had seen every layer clearly. She owed herself that. 3 sources, 3 directions, 3 people who had looked her in the face and made a choice. She drove home in silence and made dinner, and sat across from Cordell and understood for the first time that she was sitting at a table with a stranger who wore her husband's face. The divorce papers came on a Tuesday. Cordell didn't serve them himself. He had a process server come to her job, which Diane would later reflect was either cowardice or deliberate humiliation, and possibly both. Her co-worker walked into her office and handed her the envelope with the particular expression of someone who does not want to be involved, but is already involved. And Diane signed for it and closed her office door and sat very still for a long moment before she opened it. The deed paperwork was attached. The quit claim had already been filed, Cordell's name only. The transfer had gone through 11 days ago, while Diane was at work, while she was seeing patients and processing claims and doing the things she had always done, which was show up. The house she had contributed more than half the down payment on. The house she had chosen the floors for and painted the kitchen in and put her grandmother's quilt in the back bedroom. That house now belonged entirely to her husband, on paper, in the eyes of the county, as cleanly as if she had never lived there. She was given 30 days to vacate. She sat with that for the rest of the day, worked through her afternoon meetings, responded to emails, said goodbye to her co-workers at 5 o'clock with a normal face, got in her car and drove around for 40 minutes before she could make herself go home. When she got there, Cordell was not in the house. He had known she would receive the papers today, and he had removed himself from the equation, the way he had always removed himself from the hard moments, leaving the weight of things for other people to hold while he stood at a comfortable distance. She walked through the house slowly, the kitchen, the hallway, the back bedroom with her grandmother's quilt. She touched things, not sentimentally, more like documentation, more like she was trying to memorize what had been taken. She did not sleep well. She did not sleep well for many nights after that. On the third morning after she received those papers, she woke up to Gerald's voice outside. He was standing at the gate at 7:45 in the morning, dress shoes on, church slacks, like he had prepared for this, like this was an occasion. His voice carried across the street, around the corner, into Miss Claudette's kitchen where she was making her morning coffee, into the ears of the retired school teacher 2 doors down, into the consciousness of the entire block in the way that only a man with a large voice and a total lack of shame can manage. "This woman stole from my son," he was saying. "She drained his accounts, and now she's trying to take the house. She needs to leave today. Today. The whole neighborhood needs to know what kind of person is living here." Diane stood at the front door. She opened it. She looked at him. She did not say a word. She watched him perform his certainty for the neighbors who had come to their windows and their porches. She watched Miss Claudette across the street press her hand over her mouth. She watched Cordell stand 20 feet back, hands in his pockets, doing nothing. She looked at the man who had called her Cordell's first wife over dinner, who had sat at her table and eaten her food, and quietly built a legal structure designed to remove her from her own life, and she felt something in herself go absolutely still. She did not cry. She did not argue. She went back inside, packed 2 suitcases, and drove to her mother's house. The drive was 20 minutes, and she did not turn on the radio. She let the silence do what silence does, which is hold you when you have nothing else. She thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, pressing the letter into the back of her Bible and believing the words on it. She did not hate that woman. She did not blame her. That woman had done exactly what you do when you are loved correctly. She had loved back. The failure was not in the loving. The failure belonged entirely to the people who had taken it and built a scheme on top of it. Evelyn lived 20 minutes away in a brick house she had owned outright since Diane's father passed. She was 67 and small, and had the particular kind of quiet that comes from a life that has required endurance. She opened the door when she saw Diane's car, took one look at her daughter's face, and said nothing for a long time. She put on tea. She sat down across the table. And when Diane finally said everything, all of it, the deed, the account, Keisha, Gerald, the 7:45 performances on the front lawn, Evelyn listened to every word. When Diane was done, Evelyn put her hand on her daughter's and said, "They only took what they could see. They don't know what's in you." Diane didn't believe that yet. She was too emptied out to believe it. She had gone from a home and a marriage and a friendship and a church community to a suitcase at her mother's kitchen table in about 3 weeks, and the grief of that was total. Not just the love that had proven false, but the years of herself she had poured into those relationships. The Sunday dinners, the careful conversations, the patience she had extended over and over again, like a woman who believed patience was its own kind of power. The following Sunday, she got dressed for church out of pure habit. She was standing at the bathroom mirror with her earrings in before she understood that she wasn't going, that she could not sit in those pews and look at Gerald's face behind the podium, and Beverly's carefully arranged expression, and the women from the ministry circle who had been warm to her face and cold in the spaces between. She took her earrings out. She went back to the kitchen table. She drank her mother's coffee and said nothing. She stopped going. She stopped answering the calls from the circle. After about 3 weeks, the calls stopped coming. That was its own answer. That night, she opened her Bible out of habit, reaching for the letter before she remembered it wasn't there anymore. It was in her wallet. She took it out, unfolded it, read it one more time. Then she folded it smaller than it had ever been folded, put it back in her wallet behind her license, and closed it. She was not done with it yet. She did not know why. She just knew she wasn't done. She found Renata Cross the way people find the things they need most, not through a referral, not through a search, but through a conversation she wasn't supposed to have. A woman at the unemployment office, helping Diane with paperwork for a temporary benefit she qualified for during the transition period, mentioned offhandedly that her sister-in-law was a family and property attorney who had handled cases exactly like the one Diane described. Renata Cross was 44, had her own firm on Peachtree, and had a way of listening that made you feel like she was already 3 steps ahead and choosing not to alarm you. She looked at the deed transfer timeline, the bank records Diane had quietly photographed before she moved out, the quitclaim documentation, and the date on the secondary account opening. And she said 2 things. First, this wasn't just cruel. This may have been illegal. Second, don't talk to anyone, not friends, not church people, not Cordell, nobody. Diane kept both instructions. What Renata found, as she dug deeper over the following months, was that Gerald had filed the power of attorney that authorized the deed transfer using a variant of Cordell's legal name, a technical distinction that created a document whose authority was, at minimum, legally questionable, and, at maximum, a forgery. The mortgage had been jointly filed. The transfer had been executed without Diane's knowledge or consent during an active mortgage period, which created a separate chain of liability. The bank account dissipation could be documented to the day. None of this was public yet. None of it was announced. Diane went to work every day. She came home to her mother's house every night. She stopped attending Calvary Baptist. She let the women's ministry calls go to voicemail and did not return them. She also did something else. Something she had been turning over in her mind for years, since before Cordell, since before the marriage. She had always believed she could build something on her own in healthcare consulting. She had the credentials, the contacts, and a specific competency in compliance and billing that small and mid-size clinics desperately needed and rarely had budget to hire full-time. She had always said, someday, when things settle down, when there's more time, when it makes sense. Things had settled down. There was nothing but time. It made the most sense it had ever made. She registered the business in her own name on a Thursday morning and told no one. 18 months is a long time when you're in pain. It is a short time when you're building something. By the time Diane's consulting practice had its fourth active client, Cordell had already posted a vacation photo with a woman Diane had never seen before, and Gerald had been quoted in the church bulletin as a man of wisdom and discernment. And the women from the ministry circle had moved on to caring about someone else's business the way people do when there is no longer a public spectacle to maintain interest. Diane observed all of this from a distance that felt, by this point, more like altitude than absence. She was not standing outside a door that had been closed to her. She was standing somewhere higher than that, looking down at the architecture of what had been done to her, and understanding it now not as personal devastation, but as a set of decisions other people had made, decisions that had a legal shape, a financial shape, and a moral shape that were all about to be addressed. Renata called her on a Thursday in November with news. The case was ready. The court had already signed an order. The deed transfer was being reversed pending final settlement, and the forgery finding had been forwarded to the state bar and the county DA's office. Gerald's personal liability exposure was significant. The damages calculation was complete. "We can file quietly," Renata said, "and let it move through the courts without fanfare. Or, Diane said, or we deliver notice in person. There's a venue where Mr. Washington and Cordell will both be present, publicly, with witnesses. It would be legal service, and it would be on record." Diane was quiet for a moment. "When?" she said. "3 weeks, Calvary Baptist's Founders Gala. Cordell is being honored." Diane said, "I'll be there." Renata's voice was even. "You understand this will not be a performance. It will be dignified, measured, and entirely legal. You won't say anything inflammatory. You won't engage with insults." "I know," Diane said. "I don't need it to be a performance. I just need it to be witnessed." The letter was still in her wallet. She had moved it twice. Once when she got a new wallet. Once when she dropped it and had to refold it more carefully than before. It had become something worn in, like a stone carried in a pocket for so long it takes on the temperature of your body. She took it out that night and looked at it, not to feel the grief of it anymore, to remember the specific written promise inside it, the one Renata had found and submitted as part of the evidence file. The financial language buried inside the sentiment. This house and this life belong to both of us. Those were not just words. Those were a legal statement of shared intent, made in writing, on a night when no one was thinking about what the law would do with them. Diane folded it and put it back. She was ready. There was one more thing, one final moment of doubt, because peace that arrives too cleanly is never peace that lasts. 2 nights before the gala, Renata called. Her voice had the controlled quality of someone managing news carefully. One of the transfer documents, a secondary exhibit in the filing, had a clerical error on the notarization date. Not substantive, not case-breaking, but enough to require a corrected submission that would delay the final filing by 2 weeks. 2 weeks. It wasn't the end of the world. The court order was still in place. The case was still solid. But the gala was Saturday, and if they appeared to serve notice without the completed filing behind them, Gerald would know immediately that something was not fully sealed, and he would use that window. Diane sat with that for a long time. She thought about calling Beverly to say she wouldn't be coming after all. She thought about the safer path, the courthouse hallway, the quiet settlement, the version of this that happened in rooms nobody could see. Then she reached into her wallet and took out the letter. She read the first line, "I will always be your safe place." She put her phone down. She went to bed. She got up on Saturday and got dressed. The fellowship hall at Calvary Baptist was full by the time Diane arrived. Circular tables, white linens, a podium at the front with a flower arrangement and a photograph of the church's founders. People in their finest. The murmur of a community that believes itself whole and unexamined. Diane walked in wearing a dark suit the color of a winter evening. Nothing loud, nothing performative. She carried one small bag. She spoke to no one first. She found her seat near the center of the room, not the back, not the front. She sat down and folded her hands on the table. She felt the moment she was seen. Not heard, seen. Keisha spotted her from across the room, and her expression did the thing expressions do when the body knows something bad is coming before the mind can name it. Beverly gripped her husband's arm. Gerald, at the front of the room in his deacon's sash, turned and saw her, and for just a second, just 1 second, something moved across his face that he covered immediately with the practiced ease of a man who has been performing confidence his entire life. No one came to speak to Diane. The room continued. The MC made announcements. The dinner was served. Cordell was called to the podium to receive his honor. He straightened his jacket. He smiled the way men smile when they believe the narrative belongs to them. He began to speak. Something about community, about legacy, about standing on the shoulders of his father's example. He was mid-sentence when the side door of the fellowship hall opened and attorney Renata Cross walked in. She wore a gray suit and carried a leather portfolio. She was not rushing. She took a seat beside Diane with the unhurried posture of a woman who has been in many rooms and is never surprised by any of them. Gerald saw the portfolio. His composure did not break, but it shifted, just slightly, the way a foundation shifts before a crack appears. His eyes went from the portfolio to Diane's face and stayed there for a moment too long. Cordell, at the podium, had not yet seen any of this. He was still talking about legacy. Renata stood, not dramatically, formally, the way a person stands when they have something official to say and the room's attention is both required and about to be given whether it wants to be or not. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was clear and level. "My name is Renata Cross. I'm an attorney with Cross Family and Property Law. I'm here on behalf of my client, Diane Washington, and I need about 4 minutes of this room's attention." The murmur dropped. Cordell stopped talking at the podium. He turned. He saw Diane. He went still. "I am here to formally serve notice of a court order regarding the fraudulent transfer of real property," Renata continued. "The execution of an unauthorized power of attorney filed under a variant legal name, and the documented dissipation of marital assets. All three matters have been adjudicated. The orders are signed." Gerald stepped forward from the front of the room. His voice was controlled but loud, which is the particular combination of a man who is afraid and needs the room not to see it. "This is completely inappropriate. This is a private event. You have no right to disrupt." "Sir," Renata said, and she said it the way a wall says it when you walk into it. "The service of legal notice requires only the presence of the party to be served. Both parties are present. Service is complete." She crossed the room and placed the formal filing in front of Cordell, who had come down from the podium and was standing with both hands at his sides, looking like a man watching something fall that he cannot catch. "You have no right," Gerald started again. One of the event security officers, a tall man near the back who had been hired for the evening, took a step in Gerald's direction. Not a threatening step, a positioning step, the kind that says, "I'm paying attention." Diane stood up. She had not spoken yet. She had been sitting with the particular composure of a woman who has decided that the quality of her silence is the first thing she wants this room to hear. She looked at Cordell, not at Gerald, at Cordell. "I gave you every chance to do this quietly," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room was completely silent. Cordell looked at her. He opened his mouth and closed it. His new girlfriend was 3 tables away, sitting very still. The pastor of Calvary Baptist, who had known Diane for 11 years, who had visited her mother when she was ill and prayed with Diane over the phone, and once told her she was one of the most genuine members of this community he had ever had the privilege of knowing, stood up from the table of honor and looked at Gerald. "Gerald," he said quietly, "please sit down." The room shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the specific, cellular shift of a community that has been holding one story and is now being asked, slowly and irreversibly, to hold a different one. The women from the ministry circle, the deacons, the people who had heard Gerald's version on his street and in his pews and at his dinner table. They were all sitting very still and looking at something they had not expected to see, which was a woman standing in the place they had been told she could not stand, being entirely and unshakably okay. Renata reached into the portfolio and spoke again, clearly, precisely, for the record. The deed transfer was being reversed by court order, already signed. The house would revert to joint asset status pending final settlement, in which Diane would receive her full entitled share, plus damages for the illegal transfer. Gerald faced personal liability exposure on the forgery, finding that had been forwarded to the DA's office. Then Diane reached into her bag. She took out the folded letter, worn at the creases now, soft from years of being carried close. She set it on the table in front of Cordell without a word. She did not explain it. Renata had already submitted it. Every person in that room who would come to understand what it was would come to understand it in their own time. Cordell stared at it. He recognized it immediately. She could see that. He stared at his own handwriting on that cream paper, and he did not pick it up. He just stared. Gerald began speaking again, louder this time, his voice finding the register it used when he preached, the one that was supposed to fill a room and direct its attention back to him. He pointed at Diane. He said things. He was loud enough that it carried beyond the fellowship hall doors, out into the parking lot, out toward the street. The two officers arrived within minutes. Gerald's volume had ensured that. By the time they entered the hall and walked toward the front of the room, Gerald was still talking, still performing his authority with the conviction of a man who has never once had it removed from him. And so he genuinely did not believe, until the handcuffs were on, that this was what was happening. It was what was happening. Diane did not watch. She picked up her bag. She looked at the pastor, who nodded at her with an expression that she would carry for the rest of her life. She walked through the hall and out the side door and through the parking lot and got into the black sedan where her mother, Evelyn, was sitting in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap, waiting. Evelyn looked at her daughter's face. "Okay," Evelyn said. That was all. They drove home. Diane did not go back to Calvary Baptist. She did not return to the old circle. She did not make statements on social media or speak to anyone who called from the neighborhood asking what had happened. She signed the settlement papers 4 months later in Renata's office. She received her full share of the house's equity, the damages for the illegal transfer, and a portion of the dissipated assets that had been recovered through the bank audit. She deposited the money into the account that held the operating funds for her consulting practice and kept moving. 6 months after the gala, the consulting practice signed its largest contract, a regional hospital system that needed a full compliance restructuring across 3 facilities. Diane hired 2 people, moved into an office on the east side, got her own lease, her own name on the door, her own key. She called her mother the night of the contract signing, and they sat on the phone together in that particular silence that does not need to be filled. After a while, Diane said, "You were right." Evelyn said, "I know, baby. I knew it before you did." The letter, the folded, worn, carried everywhere letter, was not in her wallet anymore. She had left it in Renata's evidence file. She did not need it back. It had done what it was meant to do. It had kept a promise, just not the one Cordell meant when he wrote it. Some people, when they survive what Diane survived, want to talk about the vindication. The moment Gerald sat in handcuffs, the look on Cordell's face at the podium. They want to frame it as a victory, and but it wasn't the kind that lives in the moment of reversal. It was the kind that lives in the 18 months nobody saw. The certification courses at midnight. The client calls from her mother's kitchen table. The choice, made over and over again, not to become small, just because people had tried to shrink her. They took the house. They took the account. They took the friendship and the community and the version of herself she had spent 6 years building inside that marriage. They took all of it, and she bought the building anyway. That is what they could not account for. Not the legal case, not the court order, not even the letter. What they could not account for was a woman who had been taught by everything they did to her that she did not need them, had never needed them, to be exactly who she was. The people who tried to erase her only succeeded in teaching her exactly how much space she was allowed to take up. So, she took it. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you, if you've ever had to rebuild in silence while the people who tore you down went on with their lives like nothing happened, I want you to drop something in the comments right now. I read every single one. And tell me this: What would you have done when you heard those voices in that kitchen? Would you have walked in, or would you have waited, the way Diane did? Leave it below. And if someone in your life needs to hear this story today, share it with them. Because sometimes people need to be reminded that silence is not the same as surrender, and that the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who has decided to stop explaining herself and start building.